This little green bottle here is the national drink of South Korea. In 2022 alone, 2.29 billion bottles of this stuff was distributed across Korea. And that's even with a 12% drop from a few years earlier. It's called Soju, and it can range from anywhere between 15% alcohol all the way up to 50% for some of the high quality stuff. So Soju is traditionally made from rice, which is fermented into rice wine and then distilled into soju. However, modern day soju in these little green bottles is usually made from cheaper grains, which are fermented, distilled, and then some sweeteners are added to give it this clean, ever so slightly sweet taste. This bottle here cost me 1,751, or something like just over $1 for 360 milliliters of 15% ABV spirit. In fact, Jinro Soju has been the best-selling brand of liquor for something like over 20 years. Now, like I mentioned, mass-produced soju these days is made from cheap grains and sweeteners. However, traditionally, what makes soju different from other distilled spirits is that it's made from rice. So in today's video, I'm going to attempt to make my own soju from scratch using locally grown rice. And since this is a little risky to do by myself as a beginner, I've reached out to one of my favorite Korean YouTubers, Mr. Lee from Sul House, to help me out. And he journeyed down to my studio along with his stills, just so that we can make soju together. And I will say, before we get into this video, soju is a distilled drink, and distilling is illegal in most parts of the world without proper licenses and stuff. South Korea just happens to be one of the very few places where regular people are allowed to distill at home, as long as it stays within the home and it isn't sold. And of course, I won't be giving this away to anyone, and I of course will not be selling this to anyone. But it still goes without saying, I don't recommend you try this at home. So this project actually starts about a month before we distill. And that's because if we're going to distill soju, we need something to distill into soju. And that's where makgeolli comes in, which is Korean rice wine. Makgeolli is another super popular alcoholic beverage here in Korea. It's usually sold in larger plastic bottles for very cheap, and usually hovers around 5% ABV, just like beer. I personally enjoy drinking makgeolli, and one of the best things I find about makgeolli is the choice. There are probably dozens, if not hundreds, of different types of makgeolli available in Korea, and that's not even counting makgeolli that people make at home. So even if you don't like most makgeolli, there is bound to be a type of makgeolli somewhere that matches your taste. Now, I've made makgeolli before quite a few times, but there are quite a few different techniques that you can use to make makgeolli. So Mr. Lee recommended I make a 2-stage makgeolli, but with a slight change to the regular recipe. Normally for any stage makgeolli recipe, the ingredients ratios don't change at all. My go-to is 1 part rice, 1 part water, and then 0.1 parts nuruk. But for this makgeolli, I'm going to be using 1.5 times more water than rice. And for those of you who don't know what nuruk is, let me explain quickly. Nuruk is what makes Korean alcohol Korean. It's basically roughly ground wheat grains which are inoculated with wild yeasts and mold. And this acts as a starter for Korean fermentation and turns the starches in the rice into sugars that can be digested by the yeast and turned into alcohol. Now, I've tried to make my own nuruk, but that's a whole other video. But this time around, I'm going to be using commercial nuruk, which I bought online. And since I'm going to be making a 2-stage makgeolli, I'm dividing my rice into 2 batches of 3 kilograms. And I'm using locally grown short grain rice, basically the stuff that Koreans eat with all their meals. I'm going to gently wash the rice until it runs clear, which could take quite a few washes, and then let it soak overnight. Something did come up the day after I set this soaking, however, so this rice actually ended up soaking for 2 days and even fermented a little bit, but that shouldn't be a problem. I'll drain the rice for about an hour just to make sure all the water is properly drained out. And then to cook the rice, we're going to be steaming it. And this could take a while if you don't have a large steamer like I do, but it's totally fine to do this in batches. You might wonder why I'm not just using a rice cooker to cook the rice, and it's because a rice cooker will actually cook the rice more than we want for making rice wine. The rice has to be al dente for making rice wine, because we want the rice grains to be able to absorb the enzyme-filled liquid that is going to break down the starches in the grains into sugars. I'll transfer the rice into the steamer lined with a linen cloth. My 3 kilograms of rice ended up using both levels of my steamer. And then I'll steam on high for about an hour. Now, while the rice is steaming, I also like to start soaking my nuruk in the water we're going to use for the makgeolli. For 6 kilos of rice, I'm going to use 600 grams of nuruk. And since this is a modified recipe with a bit more water, I'm going to be using 9 liters of filtered water. I'll add my nuruk to a large mixing bowl and then add 4 liters of that water. I'll give it a mix and then also add my wine yeast as well. I'll give it another mix and then set it aside for a second while I sanitize the fermenter with alcohol and then wipe it down. So I'm going to add the remaining 5 liters of water to the fermenter and then the nuruk yeast water as well. After about an hour of steaming, I'll check the rice, and if it's sort of like an al dente doneness, then it's time to take it off the steam and let it cool off. I like to spread the rice out thinly on my countertop and then constantly turn the rice over. And I found I can cool rice to room temperature in about 10 to 20 minutes this way. Once it's cooled off completely, I'll dump the rice into the fermenter and then clean my hands real good because I'm going to use my hands to get in there and give this a good mix and massage. The trick is to break apart any clumps, and then using your hands you compress the rice so that when you release the rice, it soaks up all that good noodle water. I'll give it a good 10 minutes of mixing by hand and then I'll close it up, put it on an airlock and then set it aside somewhere fairly cool, around 20 to 25 degrees Celsius to ferment. For the first few days I'm going to crack this open and give it a good mix, but after maybe 2 or 3 days of mixing I left it for around 2 weeks to just ferment, or until the bubbles in the airlock start to slow down. And that's when I know it's time to add my second half of my rice, which I'll do the exact same as before: wash, soak, drain, steam and then cool, before adding it to the fermenter. This time I'm only going to mix it with a spatula and then set it aside to ferment for another 2 weeks. Fermenting the makgeolli like this in 2 stages is going to help slow down the fermentation of the rice wine and ultimately produce a tastier, higher ABV rice wine which should be perfect for soju. After another 2 weeks, the activity in the airlock has died down again, so I'm going to now take this makgeolli and start filtering it to separate the solids from the wine. And to do this, I'm just using some cheesecloth in a sieve in a large bowl. And bit by bit, I'm going to filter the rice wine and discard the solids, which I just ended up composting at home. Once all the rice wine was filtered, I cleaned out the original fermenter and then I moved the rice wine back in so I could cold crash this in the fridge, which should make the fine solids settle to the bottom of the fermenter, letting us skim the clear wine from the top. If we were to leave all this fine sediment in the rice wine when we distill it into soju, it could burn to the bottom of the still and taint our soju with a burnt flavor. Now this is ready to be distilled, which is still a couple days away, so in the meantime I put this back in the fridge, which should help it settle even more until distilling day comes. So distilling day is finally here and Mr. Lee from Seoul House is in my studio. And he brought along one of his stills, which is what we're going to use to distill the rice wine into soju. Simply put, distilling works by evaporating alcohol, which has a lower boiling point than water, and then condensing it back into a liquid. So to start, I'm transferring my rice wine into jugs just to make it easier to pour into the still. I managed to pour quite a bit of the rice wine without disturbing the sediment, but the last little bit of rice wine did come out a little cloudy, but that should be fine. The rice wine goes into the main pot of the still, and this is where we'll heat up the rice wine to evaporate the alcohol. We'll close the pot, then screw on the pipe that connects the pot to the condenser and turn on the heat. The alcohol vapor will travel from the pot, through the pipe and into the condenser, which is kept cool because it's submerged in ice water that we're circulating using this small pump. Once the vapor enters the condenser, it will cool and condense back into a liquid and it will come out this spout where we'll collect it. So I was also wondering how we would know whether we're collecting alcohol or water, and it's actually pretty simple. This thermometer up at the top of the still is only measuring the temperature of the vapor, and alcohol boils at 80 degrees Celsius. So as long as this thermometer is showing a vapor temperature of 80 degrees, it means the alcohol is boiling and traveling up through the pipes. However, after a while of hovering around 80 degrees, the thermometer slowly crept up to 100 degrees, which is of course the boiling point of water. And that's how we know when to cut the heat, because if we keep going, we'll only be collecting water vapor. So this first round of distilling took quite a while, probably around an hour to get through 8 liters of rice wine. And that's mostly because my studio isn't super well equipped for distilling. And we ended up with about 2.5 liters of soju, but we didn't measure this batch of soju since we're going to be doing a second round of distilling. So we cleaned out the pot and then poured the soju back in, attached everything up again and started a second round of distilling, which went by so much faster because we're not having to heat up so much water as well. In fact, the second distilling took about half the time. And for the second distilling, Mr. Lee collected the soju in smaller batches. The first batch is thrown away since this contains methanol, which is dangerous and can make you go blind. However, fermenting with rice does not produce as much methanol as there's less pectin in polished rice. So while the soju comes out of the condenser, Mr. Lee is collecting it in small batches instead of one large pot. And that's because as we work our way through distilling the soju, the flavor is going to change. And we want to collect the different stages and then blend them later to create our own flavor. After about 30 minutes of distilling this time, we're left with 2 containers of soju. One contains the first half of the distilling, and the other contains the second half of distillation. The first half has a much fruitier, almost melon and grape smell, while the second half is much nuttier and grainier. And since this is my first time making soju, I'm not too concerned about making the perfect blend. What I did end up doing was adding the second half batch to the first half until it reached about 1 liter. That way I can divide them into 2 500ml bottles for aging. Now I tasted some of the soju that we made, and even touching my lips to the soju felt like a smack in the face. I suspected because of the strength of the soju, which I later measured and found out it was hovering about 80% ABV, which is way too strong to really enjoy in my opinion, so I'll most likely water this down. But after asking Mr. Lee how I should go about lowering the ABV of the soju, he recommended first aging the soju and then reducing the ABV later down the line. So I actually need to go online and order a specific type of Korean earthenware just for aging alcohol. This earthenware is unglazed, which allows the pot to sort of breathe, allowing the soju inside to age. But unfortunately they were sold out of their smallest size pots, so I had to order one 3-liter size pot. So what I'll do instead is pour all of the soju into one pot, and then in 6 months I'll remove some of the soju to try then, and then repeat again at 1 year. And who knows, maybe I'll just keep this going for as long as possible. So if you do want to catch that video in the future, I recommend you subscribe if you haven't already. And don't worry, there'll be plenty of other stuff between now and then to keep you occupied.